Herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, hier auf der Leipziger Buchmesse. A very warm welcome to Scott McCloud.
Thank you, Tina.
Scott McCloud sounds actually like a comic figure himself, though you are the most important and very original thinker in American or in comics. You are here at the Leipzig Book Fair to introduce your new graphic novel, Der Bildhauer.
Yes.
And I asked my 9-year-old daughter, who read your book, and it's a very thick book, in the last days, I asked her what this is about. And she said, it's about a man who builds something and then gets into trouble.
That's very good. Is
that accurate? Maybe you want to specify.
Yes, it is a lot of trouble. He's a young artist who makes a deal with death to sculpt anything he wants with his bare hands, but he only has 200 days to live. And then he has the inconvenience of meeting the love of his life, and things get very complicated. And yes, he gets into a lot of trouble. That's true.
So it's a Faust story.
It is in many ways, but this time, because it's death, it's not about the punishment at the end. It's not about the afterlife at all. It's about what happens when our death is a single chop, when you can only think about what happens in life because death is a blank page.
When I grew up, comics were actually considered to be really bad for you. At least my parents thought
Yes.
they're really, really bad for you. What actually made comic, so to say, climb up in class so that it becomes something that's interesting for the cultural pages? When did this happen and why did it happen?
Well, there have always been people like me who've talked about the possibilities that comics have to be a higher literary form or a higher artistic form. But it's only when individuals prove it with their own work that we really see progress. And one step at a time, artists in Europe, in Japan, and in the United States have begun to prove that. People like Art Spiegelman and his memoir of his father's experiences in the Holocaust, Maus, or artists like Chris Ware, or artists really all over the world who are just trying to take comics and see if it's capable of something deeper, if it's capable of something more emotionally effective. Comics are just a blank page.
They're a blank page. Where do they come from? I mean, also, there are very different traditions, I would think. There is the American comic, there is the European one. Asterix or Tintin is very different than American comics.
Yeah.
Manga, again, something entirely different from Japan. Who is, so to say, the inventor?
Well, if you go back far enough, you can find examples of things that are very much like what we do today, as far as certain Egyptian wall paintings or the Bayeux tapestry. But what we do now, the sort of comics we do now, really go back at least as far as old European broadsheets. You can find broadsheets where you have panels, pages divided into panels with captions, with word balloons, actual scrolls coming out of people's mouths to show their speech. All of the things that we associate with comics today are hundreds of years old. And so it's an old idea. And that's because it's a simple idea, the simple idea of just putting one picture after another to tell a story.
And is it still somehow a subversive genre? When you look at Charlie Hebdo and the terrorist attack in France, it was cartoons that was the medium of provocation.
Yes.
What is it, this subversive element in comics? How does it happen? Is it the simplicity? The directness?
It is both of those things, and partially it was because comics was put down on a lower level. For many years, people thought that comics was only either for children or for people who couldn't read, and so it had a lower status. And from that lower status, it was able to be in some ways more honest, because other media, they wanted to be safe. Motion pictures and a lot of popular writers, they wrote things that were safe because they were very comfortable. Cartoonists were never comfortable. For many, many years, they felt like they had nothing to lose, and so they just spoke their mind. The underground comics back in the States, and a lot of the more sexually explicit comics that they inspired in Europe, these people just, they could say anything at all. But now, as comics are exhibited in museums, as literary journals are beginning to recognize them, now some cartoonists worry that comics are losing some of that vitality because they are not, they can't fly under the radar anymore. They're becoming more safe. Maybe that's true, but I think comics can be all these things. They can be subversive and they can be high art.
So interesting, subversive versus the good guys. When you look, there's this war between Disney and Warner Brothers. Disney did the good guys, the wholesome and civilized guys, Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck, whereas at Warner Brothers, they're supposed to be in the basement, and they were the rebels who kind of made the bad figures.
That's right, yeah. Disney was more suburban or rural, and Warner Brothers was more urban. It's always been this. It's that somehow, maybe because we have men and women, the human race has always wanted to divide people into two groups and see the yin and the yang, the white and the black, the high and the low. And so we always have these recurring sides being played out in our cultural dialogue. So yeah, that's true of Warner and Disney, but it's also true of many, many other pairings throughout history.
But you talked about something so interesting, that it becomes, so to say, a tamed art now. It's much more serious. It's a didactic. Is that good?
Well, it can be. It would be bad if that's all it was. But what I hoped it would be is many things. I didn't want to see comics go from low to high. I wanted to see comics go from just low to everywhere. I wanted there to still be comics, and believe me, there are still comics that fly under the radar, that are rough and crazy and explicit and scandalous and blasphemous. All of these things, they still exist, But now there's also those who are able to do it with some level of acceptance and some level of cultural dialogue that reaches into the higher levels of our culture. All of these things, it's healthy for an art form to have many different levels, many different arms, many different kinds of content and genre and artists.
What inspires you? You were telling me before that when you work, and your poor wife has to bear it, you work for a whole day. You draw
11 hours. Yeah.
And what is it? You suddenly have an idea and then you rush to your desk?
No, comics is so much slower. No, you have an idea and 5 years later you're still trying to get it started. Oh, it's such a slow art form. I had an idea for this, for the new graphic novel. I had the idea when I was in my 20s, and it was only in my 40s that I finally began to make it happen, Because you have an idea, and by the time you can finish drawing it, you've already had time to have 10 more ideas.
Is the internet actually the era of comics? Is it the same thing in a way? It is a much quicker attention span. It's much more direct. It's everything, not very selective. Is there, so to say, a relationship between the virtual world and the comic world?
There is. Well, first of all, people are much more comfortable combining words with pictures than they ever have before. When people began to use graphical web browsers, the kind of browsers that we use today, they become much more comfortable with the idea that pictures and words will always sit next to each other. And so comics, I think, is very comfortable in that world. But also, great art, all great art and great music, it spreads much more easily now in a networked world. These things, they can't be buried. There was a time when the gatekeepers could decide that this artist or this musician or this playwright was simply not going to be seen, and now that's no longer true. And that means that not only in comics, but in all the art forms, there's more diversity, because great work of all kinds finds its audience.
And is it also, when we talk about our times being such a globalized time and world, and you're just come back, you've been in China, you've been in Great Britain, is it also a universal language in a way? You don't, you can put the words in different languages, but the comic is in a way a universal language.
Yeah, as my book gets translated into one language after another, I know that most of the language, the most important language of the book, is the language of pictures. And I think sometimes we value pictures less. We see pictures as communicating less information or less nuance than words, but this isn't true at all. There's tremendous nuance in pictures. And pictures communicate in a way that has a special and intimate connection to memory as well, because this is what our memories are composed of. Our memories are composed of static images. More and more, as we learn to understand how memory works, we see that connection, and people who study memory use static images to help them remember things.
That's why they use them also in museums, like in the Anne Frank Museum, or in Holocaust stories are often told through comics. That was how they became, so to say, a more serious genre as well.
Yes, and because in school we're not always taught to read pictures in the same way that we're taught to read words, then we're not as literate. We don't always necessarily understand how much we're being communicated to by pictures. But corporations understand, governments understand, and this is why sometimes people can be more easily manipulated by imagery than they can be by words. That's why I think it's important for each new generation to become more literate, more in command of the power of pictures to communicate, because they're being communicated to whether they realize it or not.
Yes. Thank you so much for being here and talking to us.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.